Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're embarking on a journey into an organ that is often conceptually challenging for students.
Oh, absolutely.
Not because it's microscopically complex, though it is, but because it's sort of tucked away, it's highly variable, and it's just impossible to visualize without some really good descriptive guidance.
Right.
So today, we are diving deep into the spleen, pulling our insights exclusively from the detailed spatial descriptions in Chapter 69 of Gray's Anatomy.
And this is truly a mission in visualization. I mean, if you've ever tried to read one of those paragraphs describing the left kidney's relation to the splenic hilum without a diagram, you know the cognitive load involved.
Exactly.
Our goal is to extract the functional anatomy and provide a comprehensive, audio-friendly mental roadmap of this vital structure.
That's it. We're cutting through the dense terminology to give you the comprehensive overview. The spleen's tricky position, its unique protective vascular supply, and the incredible microscopic filtration system that makes it the body's ultimate blood quality control center.
So let's anchor the definition first. The spleen is essentially a large, encapsulated complex mass of vascular and lymphoid tissues.
Okay.
You find it snugly situated in the upper left quadrant of the abdominal cavity, up under the diaphragm. Its primary roles are phagocytosis, mounting strong immune responses, and managing the circulating blood elements.
So, if it does all that crucial work, why do we constantly hear that it's not strictly essential for adult life? It seems like a massive contradiction.
That's a critical question.
Yeah.
And it is non-essential in adulthood because the liver, bone marrow, and other lymphoid tissues they can take over many of its functions.
Like filtering blood.
Like filtering blood and producing some antibodies, yes.
Yeah.
But that doesn't diminish its role. I mean, it's absolutely crucial during fetal development. It's a major site of hemopoiesis, and its removal in adulthood carries a very serious lifelong risk of infection. We'll definitely come back to that.
Okay, let's unpack the gross anatomy then. How to actually locate this unique organ. The spleen is notoriously variable in size. In typical adults, we're talking, 9 to 14 centimeters long and 6 to 8 centimeters wide. And the maximum dimension is actually reached right around puberty.
And here's a fun physiological fact. Its weight can fluctuate dramatically, ranging from, say, 150 up to 350 grams in vivo.
Whoa.
And that fluctuation is determined almost entirely by the volume of blood it is actively holding at any given moment.
So to visualize its shape, I shouldn't picture an oval.
No, don't picture an oval. Picture a slightly curved, heavy wedge, almost like a massive, thick comma. That shape is entirely determined by its neighbors.
And things pressing up against it.
Exactly. The stomach, the left kidney, and the left colic flexure.
Okay, so for positioning, I'm thinking left side of the torso, high up.
Very high up. A normal adult spleen is situated between the 10th and 12th ribs, with its long axis following the path of the 11th rib. It's protected by the rib cage, and here is a major clinical takeaway. A normal spleen is never palpable during a routine abdominal exam.
So when should a doctor be able to feel it then?
It has to have undergone significant enlargement. We call that splenomegaly, requiring it to triple or even quadruple in size before its inferior pole descends enough to be felt below the left costal arch.
So if you can feel it, there's pathology.
If you can feel it, there's a problem.
We should probably mention those little anatomical quirks before we start mapping its neighbors. I'm thinking of the notches.
Yes, good point. If you look at an adult spleen, you often see these persistent notches, sometimes one, sometimes as many as 7 along its superior border. They're just reminders of its lobulated appearance during fetal development.
And then there's the accessory spleen.
Right, found in about 14% of people. This is a fully functional small island of splenic tissue that failed to merge with the main mass.
Where do they usually end up?
They usually hang out near the main gate or hilum, often tucked into the gastrosplenic ligament.
Okay, now we need to map its external relations. So picture the spleen tilted slightly forward. It has 2 main surfaces. The diaphragmatic surface is superolateral, so it's convex and smooth. This is the part facing outwards, separated from the lung and the ribs, the 10th through 12th, by the respiratory diaphragm.
Now, mentally turn that spleen over, facing the internal organs. That is the visceral surface. And it's irregular because it's where all the internal organs are pressing into it, leaving impressions.
Can you simplify the location of these 3 main impressions for us? We need to avoid the multi-axis jargon here if we can.
Absolutely. Picture that wedge shape again. The broad, concave front face, that's the gastric impression. It faces the front and slightly toward the midline, pressed right up against the posterior fundo of the stomach.
Okay, front face, stomach. Got it.
Now look toward the back and slightly underneath. That's the renal impression, which is related to the upper lateral anterior surface of the left kidney.
Back and down, kidney.
And finally, at the very anterior tip is the flatter colic impression, resting on the left colic flexure.
And right in the middle, running as a long fissure on that visceral surface, closer to the inferior border, is the splenic hilum.
Yep, where the vessels enter and exit.
And the structures that tether the spleen in place are the ligaments, remnants of the embryonic dorsal mesogastrium.
Right, we have the gastrosplenic ligament going to the stomach and the splenecolic ligament connecting it to the left colic flexure.
But the critical attachment, particularly for surgeons, is the splenorenal ligament.
Oh, absolutely. This runs between the spleen and the posterior abdominal wall near the left kidney. This ligament is a huge risk factor in surgery.
Why is that?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the splenorenal ligament doesn't just contain the essential splenic artery and vein. Inferiorly, it also houses the tail of the pancreas.
Oh, wow.
So this anatomical proximity means that when a surgeon ligates and divides the splenic vessels, there is a very real danger of injuring the pancreatic tail. And that can lead to severe complications like bleeding or pancreatic fistula.
Speaking of surgical pitfalls, I always love that phrase, the criminal fold of Morgenstern.
That's a term born in the operating room. It refers to a specific peritoneal fold, the splenomental fold, which is notorious because it can obscure vessels or cause unexpected capsular tearing if traction is applied during mobilization.
Leading to tricky, unexpected bleeding.
Exactly.
And sometimes those ligaments are, well, far too long, leading to the bizarre pathology called a wandering spleen.
Exactly. When the splenorenal and other ligaments are excessively long, the spleen becomes hypermobile. It can literally migrate outside its usual protective rib cage.
And because the vascular pedicle is stretched, it faces a high risk of torsion.
A very high risk of twisting, which is a surgical emergency.
So these attachments are crucial, not just for stability, but because within that key one, the splenorenal ligament, we find the splenic artery itself. Before we trace the blood, what is the single most bizarre feature of the splenic artery?
Its extreme tortuosity. It is one of the most coiled or winding arteries in the entire human body.
Why? That just seems like an inefficient design for blood flow.
Well, this extreme coiling isn't just an anatomical curiosity. It likely acts as a dampener.
A dampener.
Yeah, the splenic artery branches off the coeliac trunk, so it's receiving high pulsatile pressure directly from the aorta. This tortuosity likely protects the fine, delicate microcirculation within the spleen from that high pressure. It's like a buffer, ensuring the fragile filtration system isn't constantly hammered by blood surges.
That makes perfect functional sense. Okay, so the artery traces its path horizontally, running posterior to the superior border of the pancreas, right within that splenorenal ligament. But its functional anatomy is defined by segmentation.
Precisely. Before entering the hilum, the artery divides into 2 or 3 polar arteries, which then become 4 or 5 segmental arteries. This is arguably the most critical vascular point to remember.
Purchase.
There is relatively little collateral circulation between these segments. If a segmental vessel is occluded, you get an infarction, meaning that specific segment of splenic tissue just dies.
So tracing the blood inward, it goes from segmental arteries to trabecular arteries.
Yeah.
And then those leave the connective tissue framework and become central arterioles. These are the ones surrounded by lymphoid tissue, which we call the white pulp, before they finally ramify into penicillar arterioles that feed the red bulb.
The venous return follows the opposite track. Trabecular veins form segmental veins, which unite to form the main splenic vein. This vein runs posterior to the pancreas neck, crossing the posterior abdominal wall.
And the connection point here is the foundation of the entire portal system.
It is. Posterior to the neck of the pancreas, the splenic vein joins the superior mesenteric vein, the SMV, to form the hepatic portal vein.
And if you have an obstruction there,
Blood flow reverses. You get massive congestion in the spleen itself, leading directly to splenomegaly.
okay, a quick mention of control before we go microscopic. Innervation is dominated by the sympathetic nervous system, regulating blood flow. But what about the capsule itself?
Here's a key functional distinction. The motor innervation of the human splenic capsule is vestigial.
Meaning the human spleen does not contract to forcefully expel blood into the circulation.
Exactly. Unlike the spleen in many animals, like dogs or horses, ours is a passive filter.
And where does lymphatic drainage fit in?
Lymphatics begin in the organized lymphoid tissue surrounding the central arterioles. The peri-arteriolar lymphoid sheaths, or pales, flow through the trabeculae to the hilum nodes, and eventually to the coliac nodes. Crucially, there are no lymphatic vessels in the filtration system of the red pulp itself.
All right, now let's transition to the microscopic level, where the spleen truly earns its reputation as the largest single mass of lymphoid tissue in direct contact with the circulation.
We distinguish the two principal regions based on function. First, the white pulp, making up about 20% of the organ. This is the immunological headquarters.
Okay.
It's organized around the central arterioles.
Right.
The payhouse, that peri-arteriolar sheath, contains T lymphocytes, and expanding out from that, we find the B lymphocytes aggregating in lymphoid follicles.
And the classic anatomical detail here is that the central arteriole is never in the middle of that follicle. It's characteristically eccentrically placed.
Correct. Now, the bulk of the organ, about 75%, is the deep reddish-purple red pulp. This is the physical filtration device. It consists of numerous venous sinusoids, separated by a rich fibrocellular network known as the splenic cords, or cords of Billroth.
How should we visualize the cords of Billroth? They sound very abstract.
Think of the cords as a kind of spongy marketplace, just heavily populated by macrophages. The sinusoids are elongated vessels running parallel through this space.
Okay.
And the lining of these sinusoids is unique, made of narrow endothelial cells, previously called stave cells. These cells are attached intermittently, creating tiny intercellular slits, almost like wooden planks on a leaky barrel.
And those slits are the key to the famous open circulation theory, right? Which is the model supported in humans. So what does this process look like for a red blood cell traveling through?
Well, the blood cell has a tough journey. It doesn't enter the venous sinusoids directly from the capillaries. Instead, blood empties from the capillary endings directly into the reticular tissue of the splenic cords.
So it leaves the closed circulation?
It leaves the pipes. It percolates slowly through this macrophage-dense marketplace. And to get back into the venous system, it must squeeze through those tiny intercellular slits between the stave cells to re-enter the sinusoids.
That slow, torturous percolation and that squeeze test, that must be incredibly effective quality control.
It is. Only healthy, young, pliable red blood cells can successfully navigate that squeeze test. Aging, damaged, or rigid erythrocytes get trapped in the splenic cords, where they are immediately exposed to that dense population of macrophages for identification and removal.
So the spleen is performing a constant safety check on the physical integrity of your bloodstream.
That's the perfect way to put it.
Let's shift our focus to the clinical reality, starting with splenomegaly enlargement, which, as we established, is often a sign of underlying systemic pathology.
Right, whether it's infection, hematological disorders, or vascular issues, like portal hypertension.
And due to its high protected position, the spleen is one of the most frequently injured organs in blunt abdominal trauma.
Very often associated with lower left rib fractures or rapid deceleration accidents.
We should mention the classic clinical sign associated with splenic trauma, Kerr's sign.
Kerr's sign is referred pain felt in the left shoulder. This happens when blood leaking from a ruptured spleen irritates the respiratory diaphragm.
Okay.
Since the phrenic nerve supplies the diaphragm but originates from the same spinal levels as the sensory nerves supplying the shoulder, the brain just interprets that diaphragmatic irritation as shoulder pain.
When surgery is unavoidable, a splenectomy, the order of vascular ligation is absolutely crucial to minimize patient risk. Can you walk us through the rationale?
Ligation order is everything. First, you mobilize the spleen by dividing the peritoneal attachments, including the gastrosplenic and splenorenal ligaments. Then, and this is key, you ligate the splenic artery first.
Stop the inflow.
Stop the inflow. The reason is that once you do that, the spleen softens, and much of the contained blood empties out into the general circulation, a process surgeons call autotransfusion.
And you ligate the splenic vein last.
You ligate the splenic vein last to maximize that return of vital circulating volume to the patient before the organ is removed.
It's important to note, though, that conservative management and partial splenectomy are now widely preferred.
Oh, absolutely. We try to preserve as much function as possible. And if a partial splenectomy is necessary, surgeons use that vascular segmentation to their advantage.
How so?
The segment targeted for removal is intentionally devascularized, and because there's so little collateral circulation, that segment turns a visible dark blue, providing a clear, bloodless plane for surgical division.
But the most serious long-term consequence of a total splenectomy remains a lifelong concern.
It is. the severe, overwhelming post-splenectomy sepsis, particularly from encapsulated bacteria like Streptococcus pneumonia.
And to mitigate this risk.
Well, one technique involves autotransplanting viable splenic tissue into the greater omentum, provided its venous drainage is maintained, ensuring some immunological function persists.
This has been a fascinating and surprisingly detailed deep dive into an often underappreciated organ. Let's do a concise recap for the listener.
Okay.
We've established the spleen's tricky protected location high in the upper left quadrant, generally T10, T12. We focused on the crucial concepts of vascular segmentation and why the splenic artery's tortuosity is protective.
And fundamentally, we detailed the unique open circulation system, that slow, necessary process where blood leaves the capillaries, filters through the macrophage-dense splenic cords, and must squeeze through the tiny intercellular slits of the stave cells to re-enter the venous sinusoids, acting as the ultimate integrity check.
Right, all relying on a system where the fibrous capsule simply provides a static framework. So if we build on this idea of passive filtration versus active expulsion, since the human capsule does not contract and our immune defense relies on macrophages passively filtering blood in that red pulp, this raises an important question for you to consider. How might the spleen's relatively passive filtration mechanism reflect the evolutionary priorities of human immune defense compared to species that rely on sudden splenic contraction?
An excellent thought to end on. It connects anatomy, physiology, and evolution, and it highlights just how complex this supposedly non-essential organ truly is.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the anatomy and function of the spleen. We hope this has given you the clear, comprehensive mental roadmap you needed.